So let's get straight into this. A massive volcano blew its load in Iceland in 536 AD, which caused maximum suffering to ensue. For the next 18 months, a thick cloud of ash was blown over Europe and later rolled its way into Asia and the Middle East. Wherever the ash went, as did crop failure and famine. A Roman source in this period described the sun as having lost its usual light and appearing as a bluish color. He noted that the mighty vigor of the sun's heat had wasted into feebleness. In other words, it was cold. On that matter, this same source also talks of prolonged frost and unseasonable drought, with frosts occurring during the harvest that cause apples to harden when they should grow ripe and grapes to sour. He also requests the opening of granaries to relieve the quote, starving people of northern Italy. But Italy wasn't the only place to experience famine. Ireland, for example, experienced a quote, failure of bread from 536 to 539. Also, multiple Chinese sources attest to a famine that occurred in that summer and of snow in August. And even the Americas were affected, as there was supposedly a drought in Peru, impacting the Mochi peoples who inhabited those lands at the time. A large part of why this happened was because the ash caused average temperatures to drop by between 1.5 and 2.5 degrees Celsius. That's a huge amount. But just when you think one eruption wasn't enough, there was another in 540 that caused temperatures to drop even further, and another in 547 that we don't know much about, but that's a lot of loads being blown. Anyway, together these eruptions are said to be the cause of something called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, an extended period of cooler temperatures that lasted for over 100 years until around 660. But what happens next is crazy. Researchers found that these eruptions brought, yes, cooler, but also drier conditions, and this impacted all sorts of things. Most crucially of all, it increased the chances of a major disease outbreak. That's right, just when you thought things couldn't get any worse, they suddenly got a lot worse. For context of the time we're in, the Western Roman Empire had collapsed exactly 60 years prior to 536. Great strides were being made by the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian I to restore the full Old Roman Empire by reconquering lands that used to belong to the Western Romans. But shortly after the Volcanic Winter of 536, a huge problem would arise for Justinian. How to know if you have the plague? Now boy, if you have the plague, you may get one or more of these symptoms. You may also get one or more swollen, painful lymph nodes called buboes. These buboes may burst and release stinky pus. In more severe cases, bleeding may come from under your skin or out of your nose or mouth or rectum. You may also go into shock. I know I would. In even more severe cases, you may get pneumonia and cough up bloody mucus. You will probably struggle to breathe, doing so painfully. You will also probably vomit a lot. You may also experience gangrene of the extremities, when the tips of your fingers and ears and toes and nose and lips go black and the tissue dies, and shortly after, you die. Now imagine that death and suffering over and over, 10,000 times a day in one city for 4 months, and you have just a small snapshot of the Plague of Justinian. So I mentioned a city, and that city was Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire, and the place from which we have the most detailed first-hand accounts of the plague. By 543, the plague arrived in Constantinople, where it spread rapidly. Of those who suffered, historian John of Ephesus said that, quote, their bellies were swollen and their mouths wide open, throwing up pus like torrents, their eyes inflamed and their hands stretched out upwards, with corpses rotting and lying everywhere. Men feared to go into the streets because of the stink of corpses and of bodies being eaten by the dogs. The disease claimed so many lives so rapidly that the city ran out of room to bury the dead. There were corpses which split open and rotted on the streets with nobody to bury them, with women lying stripped naked and defiled with the filth of other dead, making a miserable and bitter sight, not even inside a grave, but in the streets and harbors, their corpses having been dragged there like those of dogs, with all ages lying prostrate, all ranks pressed one upon another, like beasts, not like human beings. In this terrible situation, Emperor Justinian gave instructions for people to dig large ditches and to fill them by piling up the corpses. These mass graves were then dug, each containing around 70,000 corpses. But this was still not enough, and the situation progressed to a point that bodies were stuffed into the towers of the city walls, and boats were filled with corpses, and during each sailing they were thrown overboard. John of Ephesus once again tells us in this instance that many of these corpses had rotted and putrefied died, being piled up in heaps of 2 or 3 and even of 5,000 along the entire seashore, and the pus flowed, discharging itself down into the sea. With so many people dying, work of every description ceased. Starvation was running riot. Contemporary historian Procopius tells us of confusion and disorder everywhere, as slaves lost their masters, and men who were formerly very prosperous lost their servants to the plague, with many houses and palaces alike becoming completely destitute of human inhabitants. All of this is to say that it didn't matter how wealthy or powerful you were, the disease could take you all the same. All told, the disease wiped up to 40% of Constantinople's population and killed anywhere between 15 and 100 million people in total, as it spread across Europe as well as the Middle East and Northern Africa. However, recent evidence suggests that far fewer people may have actually died than first thought, with a 2019 research paper essentially saying that our accounts of the plague are from people who lived in some of the worst affected places, so they probably exaggerated a lot of stuff. Overall, the long-term effects of the plague were likely, quote, minor at most. Having said that, historian Robert Bruton suggests that the events of 536 onwards probably helped the decline of the Roman Empire. The Justinian plague, for instance, happened just as Justinian's armies were about to complete their conquest of Italy and restore the Roman Empire to most of its former glory. He did actually achieve this conquest by 554, but by 568, barbarians managed to beat the depleted, weakened Byzantine force that still occupied and now devastated northern Italy, and they established their own non-Roman kingdom there. But with all that said, was the year 536 really the worst year to be alive? Well, maybe.